Now for today's program. Sir Simon Schama is University Professor of Art History and History at Columbia University and contributing editor of the Financial Times. He has also taught at Cambridge, Oxford, and Harvard universities. He's an award-winning author of 20 books translated into 23 languages, including 2 volumes of The Story of the Jews. Writer-presenter of 60 documentaries on art, history, and literature for BBC television, Sir Simon's upcoming PBS documentary, The Holocaust, 80 Years On, premieres on April 22nd. Director Hugo Macgregor has been shortlisted for a BAFTA and nominated numerous times for Grierson, Royal Television Society, and Emmy Awards, as well as winning numerous other awards. His films include In Vogue the 90s, the acclaimed BBC series The Story of the Jews with Simon Schama, Becoming Matisse, as well as unique access docs on the Bolshoi Theatre in Moscow and the Royal Ballet in London. Hugo is the director of the recently released film Plunderer, The Life and Times of a Nazi Art Thief, as well as the upcoming documentary Simon Schama, The Holocaust 80 Years On. Joining Simon and Hugo today is Robert Siegel. Robert was the senior host of NPR's award-winning evening news magazine All Things Considered for 30 years. He was awarded the Edward Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism and has been honored with 3 silver batons from Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, as well as the American Bar Association's Silver Gavel Award. Currently, he hosts Navigating the New Abnormal, a series of web seminars sponsored by American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Robert is a special contributor to Moment Magazine and serves on the advisory board for Moment's Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. Please welcome Sir Simon Schama, Hugo Macgregor, and Robert Siegel.
Suzanne, thank you. Simon, it's always good to see you, and Hugo, good to meet you today. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to hear from both of you first about the 80 years on part of the title here. That is, what is the particular challenge or advantage or difficulty of producing a documentary about the Holocaust 80 years after, not after it began, but 80 years after it ended, to find new things? How would you describe the difficulties you faced, and which one of you would like to go first? Hugo, why don't you go first?
Oh, God, I was going to say Simon should go first.
Somehow Simon's going to take care of himself. He'll look out for himself.
Well, I mean, I'll probably say things that Simon will say, but I think this is Simon's film. It was a very personal film. So I think, the impetus for doing it very much stems from him first. That was my goal. It wasn't really my story to tell. It was Simon's. And my job was to basically facilitate the best way that one could do that, and help navigate a sort of journey. It's a cliche in television, but a journey through certain periods of the Holocaust and certain locations that would give Simon the best material to kind of talk about, experience, and react to. But I'd say, 80 years on is a really, really crucial moment in the Holocaust history. And Simon will elaborate on this much better than me. But we are at a point where things are changing. And I don't mean things politically. Of course, that's happening in terms of the background context. But in terms of the Holocaust itself, we are on the edge of a precipice when survivors really won't be with us for much longer. And I think that basically crystallized and that made it all the more purposeful of why this story had to be retold at this particular time, because it feels like the baton is now going to have to be passed to people like historians like Simon. So that's probably the best way to tee Simon up with Simon.
Simon, you're teed up.
Yes, Hugo, perfect tear. Well, it comes from a paradox, really, Robert. I think actually, if I've been asked, say, 10 years ago, to say, well, wouldn't you,
Simon? I'm not.
Oh, what was happening?
Your sound went away for a second.
I'm sorry. Yes, yes. How dare it, really? But no, I think if I'd been asked, Robert, 10, 15 years ago, to kind of book a date for the 80th anniversary for yet another documentary about the Holocaust, I might have been tempted to say, I'm not sure I can ever do it justice. I'm not sure that television or even writing actually can possibly register the full enormity of the thing. But I would also have said, foolishly, I'm sort of setting myself up here actually for the correction, which made me leap at doing this. I would also said, well, everybody knows, Auschwitz. Is there can there possibly be anything more to say? It's horrific. It's awful. The boxcars, the gassings, and so on. And then there is Anne Frank, which registers millions of people. And but I wasn't asked 15 years ago, and the most extraordinary, awful, malignant jack in the box, the monster surprise was that far from there being a settled consensus about the enormity and unique atrociousness of the Holocaust, we find again for example, on podcasts, I won't name names, that go to tens of millions of people, the host entertaining someone who's a Holocaust denier, who describes Churchill as the real villain of the Second World War and the Holocaust itself as some sort of sanitation measure. So absolutely extraordinarily, just at the point where the danger seemed to be know-it-all apathy, or being able to presume that everybody would never challenge the central truths of the Holocaust, just the opposite has happened. So I thought, well, away with fastidious intellectual scruples, if that's what I had, away with the kind of what seemed to me to be a sort of real anxiety about how do we do the justice and how can we achieve new things, just was absolutely turned round by the perils, the rise of multiplied on social media, bitter, horrific falsehoods. And as Hugo implied also, the historiography of the Holocaust has become very interesting just over the last 5 or so years, Robert. I don't know if you've read the work of the English historian Dan Stone, The Holocaust and Unfinished History. But he and others have made a very important point, namely that we all thought that the Holocaust could be treated like any other kind of historical phenomenon. You lay out the data, you investigate causes, you investigate effects, and so on and so forth. And what Dan is saying is that when you look at the Holocaust, as we've tried to in the film, not starting with the gas chambers, but starting, for example, with the horrific so-called Holocaust of bullets, which murdered more than 1 million people in less than a year. When you look at that, when you expand the time slot in which mass extermination happened, and you also expand the sense of who actually was enacting it, you have all sorts of possibly, really startling, unwelcome, but startling stories to tell and things to say. So from that, I think above all, the sort of sense of the trivialization and falsification of the Holocaust, it's a Hillel thing, Robert, if not now, then when?
Yes.
That old pest from 2,000 years ago.
The central message of the film, if it can be boiled down to a single message, is uttered by a man who just died this year as he was nearing his 99th birthday, Marian Turski, a Polish Jew who had experienced, I believe it was the Łódź ghetto and also Auschwitz.
Yes.
And he says that Auschwitz didn't fall from the sky. It comes step by step. Evil comes step by step. And that seems to be your most important point here, that the Holocaust should be seen as the culmination of many centuries of the hatred of Jews in Europe.
Yes, that's Hugo and I, we made one of the episodes of The Story of the Jews on PBS as well, which grappled with that. But I need a whole new series to do it in, really, because Jews have been. I'll give you one example. For instance, it was a cliche, a truism of the most odious Nazi propaganda that the Jews were kind of a walking infection, a sort of bipedal bacterium, really. And that to do away with Jews was to do a cleansing, a purification operation. Now, that trope of actually the Jews being a kind of a physical danger, a sort of disease, a human disease in themselves, begins in antiquity. It actually begins in the Hellenistic and early Roman Empire, where there are extraordinary narratives recited, for example, by someone who I once revered, Tacitus, the historian, who says, well, the Exodus story is a complete fabrication that the Jews have dreamt up. The truth about the Exodus story is that they were expelled from Egypt by a diligent Pharaoh because they were carrying leprosy, that they're carrying some sort of awful physical infection with them. So in order, when I say, you have to think of hundreds, if not thousands of years of regarding the Jews as not quite human and therefore available to be slaughtered, is a very, very long story indeed. And in this film, we reduce it necessarily to one or two sentences. But anybody out there with a big checkbook, let's do another series on that.
Hugo, it occurred to me as a filmmaker, you must have been, I don't know where who was your source of the information, but to connect with the story of Oneg Shabbat, the group in the Warsaw Ghetto that took notes documenting what was happening to the Jews in Poland and buried them for safekeeping, understanding that they might not be around to tell the story, probably wouldn't be, but the story should be told. To have their story and that of the Sonderkommando, the Jew who for a couple of years actually swept at least the remains. I don't know if he also pushed the people when they were still alive into the ovens.
It's likely he did, actually, I think.
Yes.
Right.
He survived doing that and took copious notes describing very bluntly what he did, and hid these things away. And I thought, my gosh, as a filmmaker approaching the subject, not for the first time, this is not the first Holocaust program anybody's going to see. It seems like just great source material to work from.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, Simon did point us in the direction of those stories quite early on. Simon's knowledge is extraordinary, and I think one of the actually there's more than that. There's in Ponar, the killing pits of Ponar, outside of Vilnius in Lithuania.
Yes.
Simon reads the diary from a man called Kazimierz Sakowicz. He was a Polish journalist who lived on the site. He lived just by the gate, so the opening gate, so he could see through. And apparently, he was a journalist. He would go out and sort of get information, and he wrote this extraordinary diary of very sort of matter-of-fact diary where he's talking about the weather and then the shootings in the same paragraph. It's a sort of cloudy day, stillness light, whatever, and then the shots from the forest. But he witnessed it from his attic window. He would spy, but he'd also go out and ask locals what's happening and seeing stuff that was happened. He also buried his diaries because he was so afraid of them being discovered. He buried them in lemonade bottles in his garden in different places, and they were discovered after the war as well. So there was a connect between a lot of these voices, and he was also killed actually in an ambush in 1943. So a lot of the, I think that was a really strong connecting point through the film, that we would not necessarily use the testimony of survivors, which we see so often as honorable and extraordinary as that is, but actually look at the victims who had left these records. And Simon felt very strongly from the very beginning that those voices should be sort of brought back to life and heard, because in a way their records are also the freshest, and they immerse you into what's happening in that very moment of time, which a survivor's memories do very different things. And so that plunging you into the present tense of that as a filmmaker was a real challenge, and Simon delivered that beautifully in the film. So it was always a very strong point of what we wanted to do.
It did occur to me, Simon, that it's one reason why we hear rather little about, not in your documentary, it's not what you're reporting on, but in general, there's little said about the genocide of the Roma of Europe. There weren't the journalists and the historians and the archivists and the memoirists and the compilers of scenes among them, and therefore their story is perhaps told not as often as it should be.
I wonder if that's true, Robert. It only just occurs to me, I mean, the happenstance really of, for example, Salman Gradovsky's The Sonderkommando, who describes in this horrifying graphic detail, he too buried his little there's not a book, they're two lengthy manuscripts which are in the Auschwitz archive now. He too buried it under a tree. And the sort of happenstance of these things being recovered is extraordinary. But in the Jewish tradition, memory is, well, the only religion which an absolute commandment, not one of the 10 commandments, but certainly there in Haggadah, we're commanded to remember. There is always a sort of sense hovering over the rabbinical and Jewish tradition, isn't there, that actually we will never be remembered on monuments, unlike the classical societies, or unlike the decorated, tombs of pharaohs, that somehow there has to be written, portable, a script of some sort which will bear witness. I mean, that goes back to all the, all the chronicles of lamentation at the time of the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century. That's very much part of our kind of communal DNA. So what was very striking to me among all these writings was the absolute perfervid intensity of the writers, and sometimes even people taking photographs or drawing images like Gela Seckstein, that they were resigned to death. They were certain pretty much that they were going to die, and nearly all of them did indeed die. But what absolutely drove them on and on and on was to do everything they possibly could, that the words, exactly as Hugo says, at the immediate moment, immediately what it was like, would be preserved. And today we've had, there are very, very famous, extraordinary writings, Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, Anne Frank, who was definitely a writer and would have been, I think, had she survived. But there are plenty of other writers, and I absolutely felt almost a kind of weird, without being pretentious about it, personal bond with them, almost a kind of communion. I wanted to be their voice for our generation in a very perilous time that we're going through ourselves. So immediacy, presence was incredibly important. I mean, I remember having a talk with Hugo. We were talking about the brilliant film of Jonathan Glazer's The Zone of Interest, but I did say, in the end, the film aggravated me, not for any rational cause, but it was completely Jew-free. There was absolutely no presence of the victims in it whatsoever. That, of course, was the point of the film. But when Jews get, as one critic said, reduced to kind of room tone, to a kind of soundscape, as the grand sentence goes, I thought, well, all these figures, and some of them in terms of literary power, are brilliant writers. Chaim Kaplan in the Warsaw Ghetto is an extraordinary writer. Etty Hillesum in the Netherlands is in her own right an extraordinary writer who should be as well known as Anne Frank. So I was sort of their ventriloquist in a way. I was their medium, that was what got me through it, I think.
So I think, just for a pointer for the audience that haven't seen the film, it might be just worth explaining that Simon visits 4 locations in the film, 4 different territories. We start in Lithuania and do the Holocaust of Bullets. We'll tell a part of the story of the Holocaust of Bullets. We move to Warsaw and do the ghetto. And tell the story of this amazing group of people that sort of contradicted the Germans' wishes of sort of destroying, not allowing their voice to kind of live, to describe what's happening to them. They did that. They got together and they created an archive and buried it under the ground that was discovered after the war. The third part of the film goes to the Netherlands, and we feature a diarist there called Etty Hillesum. But that story really is about the complicity of the government institutions that sort of step by step mean that the rest of the population fall into line with the Holocaust, even though it's a very tolerant country. And as Simon eloquently says in the film, one of the very few places of safety for centuries. And the last part of the film finally does get to Auschwitz, and there we do feature the diary of Sonderkommando Salman Gradovsky. So that's the context of the conversation we're talking about.
I'd like to hear from both of you about what the how the documentary treats the events in Kaunas, Lithuania, and the significance you attach to those events, whichever one of you wants. Simon, do you want to?
Yes, I can tee Simon up with the beginning, just to say that we open the film with this sequence in Lithuania, and we follow Simon going to a town called Kaunas, where his mother's ancestry comes from, and we then go to Vilnius as well. So there we are.
Okay.
Yes, well, Robert, you and I are landslider. We both
Yes, my grandmother came from
Lithuania.
Kaunas.
Right, and both our families were not victims of the Holocaust in Lithuania. Certainly mine weren't, because yours came to America in the 1890s. My mother's family, the Steinbergs, came to Britain just 10 years after that, just around 1900. But of course, actually, in both my grandparents' stories and in my mother's stories from them, there was this enormous reverence for Kaunas, along with Vilna. Vilnius was always thought to be the great capital of Orthodox learning, going all the way back to the famous Vilna Gaon of the late 18th century. But Kovno, in Kovno in Yiddish, was also thought of as an extraordinary place where you could lead an urban life, but also you would be steeped in learning of every conceivable kind. My own family actually lived, I think it was somewhere northwest of Kaunas. They were in the lumber business, and so they were kind of orthodox talit wearing lumberjacks, basically, which may sound paradoxical, but that's exactly what they were. But they went into Kaunas very often to actually schlep timber there as well as on the river. So this was a world I understood as a child, actually, from my grandparents. I felt I knew very well. And there, but for the grace of historical timing and a sense of the necessity of urgent exit, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. So I felt that, that spoke to me, that sort of sang to me its own particular lament. But also it was just horrifying and extraordinary how massacre happened there so soon after the German invasion. I mean, within days of the Germans occupying Kaunas, there was a horrifying pogrom where the rabbi of Slobodka, the Orthodox Jewish quarter over the river, was beheaded while he was studying the Torah, and his bloody head, decapitated head, was put in the window of his house on the Torah, which he was reading. So this elaborate, monstrous exercise in sadism happened very early on. And even more ominously, the following 2 days, there was a horrific massacre of around 70 people in broad daylight in a public square, not in a public square, in a car park of the Liutekis garage, surrounded by, because the Germans took photographs, because it was for them an experiment to see whether the local population would be eager to assist in the death of Jews. So there are many photos of people standing around watching as bodies were sort of dumped yet again into this pool of blood. So,
and the perpetrators of this violence in Kaunas were not Germans.
They weren't Germans. They were encouraged by Germans. No, one of the first things when the pogrom was being organized was the release from prison of ultra-nationalist Lithuanian partisans who were eager to take revenge on the Soviet regime who were associated with Jews. As usual, there were some Jews in the regime, but that didn't really matter. They were sort of, so there was this extraordinary sense, this is the other side of step by step. There were moments when the exterminating impulse exploded out of the gate. And the Germans, who actually we found this extraordinary, a filmmaker, a Lithuanian filmmaker, who's been heroically devoted to researching and recording the events in Lithuania. And we have a wonderfully moving interview with him. I don't know if Hugo knew about this. I certainly didn't know, but he had discovered that a small plane was flown by the Germans, by a Luftwaffe small plane, twin-engine plane, to photograph the the proceedings of the massacres at the Lüttich's garage to send back to Berlin, so that the high command in Berlin, possibly including Hitler himself, could know for sure, be reassured that the SS wouldn't have to do all this dirty work alone. They could dependably rely on the enthusiasm of local populations to get rid of as many Jews as they possibly could in the most expeditiously savage way.
Just like to add, they were filming it from the airplane, so it was filmed footage that no longer exists. But Saulius witnessed a lot of, he interviewed a lot of the witnesses who were very young at the time, and different people that didn't know each other, and they all said this airplane was circling around, hovering over this enclosed space in the center of Kaunas. So the whole thing sort of felt like a setup. It was really an experiment, releasing prisoners, putting a number of, local Jewish men who happened to live in the local area in an enclosed space, and releasing these prisoners, these Lithuanian nationalists onto that to see what would happen and to film it. And actually, what was also in the sources, although films, that the Germans were genuinely surprised quite how positive the local Lithuanians were to actually carry out the murder. They were taken back. They were actually taken by surprise by what happened.
This is what I wanted to pursue with both of you, just very briefly, because I've recently been reading about Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews, and one of the big issues between Roosevelt's very close Jewish advisors and his Secretary of State at the time was how to react to the terrible wave of pogroms in the Russian Empire that had erupted after the famous Kishinev pogrom and after the U.S. had criticized Russian behavior. A terrible wave of pogroms takes place, and this is in the very beginning of the 20th century. Leaving that period aside, in the years right after World War I, Munich was filling up with refugees, Jewish refugees, from a terrible, vicious war that's going on across the border, a moving border, as it turned out. And I'm surprised that the Germans were surprised. I would have thought that the issue had been settled certainly by the Second World War, that the people in that part, in fact, I think people would say one of the problems that people had to overcome to get some action in defense of Jews in Eastern Europe was the tendency of people to say, as they might say about the Middle East today, well, that's the sort of thing that happens in that area. It's a tough neighborhood. The people there, So I was surprised. I was surprised by the Germans' surprise, and I don't know.
And I think there's something I spoke to on a separate project. I spoke to Dr. Wendy Lauer, who's an amazing professor of the Holocaust in Claremont, and she said that actually what the Germans did is, a lot of local nationalists who had managed to sort of escape prison by the Soviets, they sent them, they allowed them to travel to Berlin, and they got them to draw maps of local Jewish populations and where Jewish treasures were, so that before the actual invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans knew from these effective sources where all the local populations were well in advance of actually invading the Soviet Union, because all the information had been given to them. So that was also a pretty shocking fact that sort of helped inform our story. And I've never let go of it in my head, actually, that was all in place before the invasion actually happened.
I think I'd say, Robert, that on the one hand, who knows how surprised the Germans were or not, but they almost certainly thought, well, we'll let them do their barbaric thing, but we're interested to see actually how this can be managed for the larger purpose of strategic extermination. So the three dots that have to be joined. One, they did, manage this extraordinarily. You let them do it. You create a situation of absolutely bloody, horrible havoc. And then you create a ghetto under the ostensible pretext of actually making things orderly and not having to go through this impulsive, spontaneous letting of blood. And the ghetto, of course, is actually a pondering time of how do we go to point three, which is deportations, mass execution, day after day after day in the forests. So these three things were, tactics, but really strategically joined. And I don't quite buy into the notion that the Germans are making it all up as they go along. I think actually they're extremely clear-eyed, actually, about all these necessary stages, the bloody havoc, the enclosure of the Jews, or in the case of the Netherlands, the optimization of data about where they are. And then you're in a position actually to deliver the deportations and the mass shootings or the mass gassings.
And Hugo, you were making air quotes there for a moment.
I was saying that there's this extraordinary moment again recorded by a diarist where the first ghettos that are created in Kaunas and Vilnius and in other places in Lithuania, they're done to protect the local Jewish populations from local violence. So that's the sort of pretext that they were created under, that they were for protective purposes, which is just terrific.
I mean, there were some local SS commandos of the Einsatz, commando, the action groups who were carrying out mass shootings. There were Stahlecker and I think Einsatz Commando 1, which was in the Baltic states and Lithuania, who really can't wait. I mean, so the ghetto in Kaunas is really quite short-lived, and even before the ghetto is completely cleared by deportations in October 1942, a year earlier. So we're going from the instant slaughter of late summer 1941 to October, the autumn of 1941. Stahlecker thinks, well, let's have 10,000 bodies at the site of the Ninth Fort, the Tsarist fort that we filmed. So, the horrifying notion of why wait around? We can take a slice out of the ghetto, particularly women and children being the ultimate target. Of course, you don't want another generation of Jews to grow up. So you take a chunk out of the ghetto, 10,000, and you murder them. It's almost 10,000, 9,900, I think. You murder them all in a day and a half.
Yes, I mean, I had always I had known that children in the selections that would take place at Auschwitz, for example, children would automatically go, unless they were Roma twins or whatever Dr. Mengele was studying at that moment. The Jewish children would be sent straight to the gas chambers, and I had thought that was because they would be of no use to the labor camp side of Auschwitz. But you're saying that in addition to that argument, there was a desire to stamp out the children, to stamp out Jews.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No further generation. So women of of an age where they could reproduce children were also highlighted. It's true that most women on the selection ramp at Auschwitz, and if they could be laborers, of course, that's how some of them, thank God, managed to survive, were sent to the labor camp. So they had a chance. But the more women of childbearing age that could be exterminated along with the children themselves, the better. That was definitely part of the plan.
So I did some subtraction with this 80-year figure, and I figured out that when I was a high school student studying world history and learning about things like world wars and whatever, 80 years earlier, 80 years before that, was sometime in the 1880s, before a good deal before the Spanish-American War. This is 80 years is a long time. So I want you both to think into to imagine the future for a moment here, which is 80 years on from now. What role do you think the Holocaust will occupy in people's understandings about either world history or European history or morality or the story of the Jews? Will it be a parochial concern of a very small minority or a piece of curriculum? I wonder what will people still be making documentaries about it? What are your feelings about this?
That's such a Robert Siegel question, really.
Yeah, no,
So
I
so
can't help it.
profound. It's so profound and so impossible to answer. But that between speculate next to speculation may be hope. So what you take out of the story, the familiar story of Auschwitz and Treblinka and places like that, and the less familiar story that we've tried to tell, is just what human beings are capable of doing to each other. And it's true that the Armenia massacres, the Rwanda genocide, there are plenty of other instances, some that weren't documented. It wasn't fun to be in the wake of the Yellow Horde in the High Middle Ages either. But because we have photographs and writing and testimony that is so rich and so dense, as a kind of, the never again is a sort of cliche almost, but it's because actually there will always be something monstrous that happens again. But you do hope that that it is a document that will survive, that is sobering for the future of humanity, really. And that's the best you can do, even though we're in this painfully paradoxical moment where, notwithstanding all of our documentaries, all of our writings, all of the memorials and museums, anti-Semitism, like a kind of zombie monster, leaps out of the past and stalks through contemporary life all over again. That's not a reason for abandoning the attempt at education. I'm, both of us in our ways, all three of us in our ways, are educators, really. And in that, 80 years hence, who knows whether artificial intelligence will have made us redundant anyway. It may be that AI is, I don't know, a better archivist than we've managed to be of this terrible thing. But the fact of the ultimate enormity of what humans might do to each other, you just hope will be there as a kind of sobering lesson.
And Hugo, thoughts about?
Well, I mean, my initial thought was, it all depends whether something like it happens soon before the next 80 years turns up, because if the world is spiraling back into a place of similarity of what happened in the 1930s in so many ways. Economic difficulties mean that all the sort of old tribal cliches and all the demonization of the other is re-emerging with sort of huge force again in our current climate. And the question is that, I'm ever hopeful that we won't lead to something like the Holocaust ever again. But if it does, then of course it will come back into public consciousness in the most extraordinary way. That's the horrible, that's the pessimistic view, I guess. But I prefer Simon's more optimistic answer.
There's something you mentioned in the documentary, which is just a horrible irony. It describes the lot of the Dutch Jews, and the fact that the Netherlands was historically very friendly ground for the Jewish people, certainly by European standards, and it was. There was even a general strike. There was against the Nazi occupation, and that's a real sign of solidarity with their Jewish neighbors, and all of that probably had the effect of instilling in Dutch Jews a false confidence in their future, and may have led to this strange statistic that the Netherlands was the country whose Jewish community suffered the highest percent loss of mortality to the Nazis.
Yeah. In Western Europe, yeah.
In Western Europe.
Yes. Philip Roth's great novel, The Plot Against America.
Yes.
Fantasizes about Lindbergh as president and, the threats against Jews being not taken seriously, or this can never happen in America, and so on. I mean, I felt so spellbound by that novel when Roth published it, really. Because, as I say, the Holocaust can come with its gloves on until the gloves are taken off. And the experience of the Netherlands, which, as you rightly say, Robert, been and Hugo said, the most tolerant place for Jewish life since the early 17th century, of actually being the victims of bureaucratic indifference, of people, a culture which initially stayed true to its sympathetic tolerance of Jews. It's not true that there was no anti-Semitism in the Netherlands ever, but it was of a kind of tiny, minimal variety compared to almost everywhere else. There was no Dutch Dreyfus case or anything like it, for instance. So yes, the false confidence that this, Amsterdam had a Yiddish name, Mokum, the place, also same word in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
So it was regarded as the ultimate asylum, the ultimate safety place. And so the notion was that institutions, and not Jewish institutions, but institutions of governance, whether it's the police force or the civil service or whoever, will ultimately not be bent to the will of cruel barbarians. That extermination, if there's going to be a labor camp, it will be a labor camp. You'll have to work, it'll be very hard. You have to leave Amsterdam, but you'll get your apartment or your house back. We'll survive as we've always survived. So they were to see, and again, the Germans extraordinarily canny playing along with that until the deportations themselves began. So that's sort of tragic. And it, for me, as a English Jew growing up not long after the war, it was very easy for me to see how that might have been the same sort of situation had Hitler made it across the English Channel. That
yes, you say that, and you say that in the film that if Hitler had crossed the Channel,
I think
what
there have been
happened
very
in the
brave
Netherlands would have
people.
played out in
Churchill, of course, would have mounted a de Gaulle-like resistance in the Hebrides or somewhere like that, and there would have been many people who have been very brave, and gradually they would have thought more about self-preservation. It's another human instinct to do so. And as I say, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation.
I think I'd just add that that story in a way has the most, I mean, all of it has contemporary resonance, but it had particular chilling resonance in the fact that after this general strike, so in 1941, a huge general strike breaks out against the treatment of Jews, against the German occupation. It's brutally quashed by the German regime. And the Germans used that strike as an excuse to replace key sort of members of the bureaucracy or the infrastructure of Dutch government. Certain mayors, the head of the police force, certain judges, so the head of judiciary, with yes men. And once that happens, the rest of the civil service starts to fall into line because the threat and the fear is so great of unrest. And you can see all those parallels happening in in so many other places that are happening, and that ultimately leads to the entrapment of the Jewish populations in the Netherlands, who really had nowhere to escape. They couldn't go to the North Sea was basically the only place they could go, but very quickly those routes were closed off. So there was literally nowhere else they could go, and by that point it was too late. So it's extremely chilling, that story, I have to say. It's the one that the sort of, they all get under your skin in a certain way, but that one had, because it relied so much on the passivity of so many people to allow that situation to happen.
Simon, I guess before I hand off to Suzanne and our viewers, I just wanted to ask the question. You've published books and done documentaries about the Jews in the past. Was this received any differently given the current mood of at least a revived tolerance of anti-Semitism and a revival of an increase in the number of anti-Semitic acts in recent years? Or have you not experienced that?
Well, the press reception was extremely generous, and I have to say, irreproachable in taking the film seriously and asking interesting questions, really. So, but I don't know about you, Robert, but I protect myself. Our producer, Jyoti Mehta, has been fielding both enormous expressions of appreciation. I've had lots and lots and lots of emails from people who are not Jewish, who know nothing about Jewish history, who thought they knew everything there was to know about the Holocaust. So that's been, but apparently, there's been the usual cascade of poison as well, actually. And
Usual or unusually?
well, no, I find, have you not? I mean, I did actually a long time ago. Ron Rosenbaum set a number of us to, maybe you were among them actually, to talk about the outbreak of anti-Semitism. I'm really talking about 15 years ago, and like an idiot, I actually volunteered to do online anti-Semitism, which was sort of, and I was horrified with what I found. And actually, when the book came out, I got regular communications with me in striped pajamas, me with my head in a gas oven, the whole hideous. It was almost all neo-Nazi. It was almost neo-Nazi. So I don't know. I don't think of myself as having a particularly thick skin, but maybe it comes involuntarily anyway. So, but whatever. What we I've also been lecturing about the film and about anti-Semitism in Australia, for example. And I did expect, you Jews go on all the time about Auschwitz. Now it's time to talk about Gaza and so on. And I'm absolutely prepared. It seems to me possible to hold two thoughts in your mind. You can feel deeply, desperately, and tragically about the suffering and horror that the Palestinians in Gaza are going through, and at the same time, register with full, immense force exactly how horrific the Holocaust was. In some ways, I would still say uniquely horrific. I don't know if that is the question. The answer.
Yes, that answers my question. And Hugo, if you want to answer the question, feel free. But no,
Simon's done it brilliantly.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you for a fascinating conversation and hand you over to my friend Suzanne.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank all three of you for that really important conversation. I want to remind people the name of the documentary is The Holocaust 80 Years On. It will premiere on PBS on April 22nd. I put a link in the chat and we'll send that out again.
Suzanne, are we sure it's the 22nd or the 21st? I'm getting mixed messages actually from but
We'll double check that.
Okay.
It's on the PBS.
Oh well, they would know. They would know. Thank you.
Yeah. It's the 20 on PBS. It says April 22nd.
Okay, thank you.
People can see it then. We've gotten several questions about Holocaust denial, and that one person asked, do we just ignore it? Do we debate a Holocaust denier? Somebody also talked about Holocaust education in public schools. It's now mandated in about 25 states, but we're still having people who deny that the Holocaust exists. And I suppose there will be people who will say your film is not true as well. So how do we continue to combat that?
I suppose it's my question. Yes, I so admire my friend Deborah Lipstadt for everything she went through with the David Irving trial, and we thought, well, that's settled that. Of course, it hadn't settled it, and in the kind of environment we're in, digital environment we're in, the environment of social media is, you could say, it really is the case that the earth is round, and you'll be met with the view that, well, that's just your opinion. So you can say it till you're blue in the face, here are the millions that were murdered. And, so my instinct is to engage in the debate, but it depends really whether you're debating with someone who's just going to kind of scream and shout and deny everything at you. It's quite difficult to get that reassurance in advance, isn't it? But if there was somebody who said the sort of things that that I've just been characterizing, I would absolutely debate with them, because you can pull out a lot of the evidence, for example, about the horrific extent of the Holocaust of bullets comes from absolutely characteristically exhaustive German enumeration. Each Einsatzkommando regiment competing with the other to show how brilliant they've been in dispatching tens of thousands of Jews in their own parish of murder. So you pull out German evidence, really. It's quite true that if the denier is really completely Meshuggah, then in a state of unanswerability, say, well, you forged, these German documents have been forged. So that's not a very satisfactory answer to your excellent question put by one of the viewers, because it's very difficult to kind of gauge in advance. But if there's someone who is, this figure in America is called Darrell Cooper, famously a sort of self-taught historian who appeared on both Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. May their innards rot for them doing it. Actually, would I go head to head with him? Absolutely, bring it on. And certainly don't abate. I mean, one of the reasons we made the film really was to sort of break the kind of clotting, I would put it, of an extraordinary, overwhelming phenomenon into a kind of familiar set of boxes or pigeonholes. The Auschwitz pigeonhole, the Anne Frank pigeonhole. There is much for people to learn, as a lot of the people who responded to the film have accepted and welcomed, and not just Jews at all.
Which is why we went back to the primary source evidence every time, in every single story. Almost unimpeachable evidence. Yeah.
I mean, as you showed in the film, there are many instances of, and you talked about people who had buried their diaries. Do you think there is still a lot to be found underground?
I mean, yes. I mean, there's one story in Warsaw where we cover, which we've talked about. This group who they call themselves Oyneg Shabbos, right? Shabbos, right, Simon?
Oyneg Shabbos, yeah. But we call them
Oyneg Shabbat, we call them in the film. But there is a third archive still buried underground somewhere in Warsaw, which they've never found.
The rumor is it's under the Chinese embassy. Actually,
they've done excavations under the Chinese embassy.
Did they?
Yes, they haven't found it. And also in Auschwitz, there are, alongside our character Salman Grodowski, who buried he so movingly describes in his diaries that he buried his work in two separate places, one of which was actually in the ash pit, so the ashes are for the victims, so that because he knew that no one would look there. So, and it was like a message in a bottle, sort of putting these messages out into the world and just hoping they might be found after the war. They miraculously were found. But alongside that were 4 other scrolls by 4 different people, one of which was just a letter, which is now in France. But it's likely that there are more under the ground in Auschwitz too. I mean, it was definitely a thing. It was that they did it together. They clubbed together. The prisoners, the Sonderkommando, would use labels on potato sacks, which they'd found.
Laundry tags as well.
Laundry tags, and they would protect the writers. They knew there were good writers in their midst, and those that couldn't write very well would protect the writers and give them pens or what they found off other prisoners or bodies or wherever they found these things. There was a place called Canada in Auschwitz, which is they called it Canada because Canada was the land of plenty, which was where all the goods that were taken off arrivals were placed in these warehouses, and they had Sonderkommando looking after the warehouses, and they would smuggle out pens from this place or camera film to kind of record things. And it was a sort of real bubbling resistance movement within the camp. So the likelihood is that there is a lot more somewhere. Yes.
There's this totally sentimental speculation on my part as a Jewish historian. There is this tradition, essentially medieval, of micrographics. Those of you, there are some in the Israel Museum. I mean, there are a lot of them. I don't know if Robert has seen them, but these are sometimes transcriptions of passages in the Mishnah, the first commentary on the Bible, sometimes passages from the Bible in absolutely minute, we're talking about letters 1 millimeter high. They're extraordinary feats. You wonder how it's possible that a human hand could actually write with script that tiny. So again, I've absolutely no evidence they knew that at all. But the sort of intensity with which you want to put words down on any available surface is lodged very deep in Jewish culture and history.
And I'd also to add one other thing to that. I really like this question, so sorry, I'm going to add another thought. But there were a lot of archives in Eastern Europe, particularly in Soviet ex-Soviet areas, where there are these documents, but no one knows what they are. They simply haven't been scanned. They're in a different language. And actually, the diary of the Polish journalist was only discovered, rediscovered, I think, in the 1990s by a survivor, because she understood the words that were written on the page, and she sort of thought, oh my gosh, this might be something, and then started to investigate it, and the world opened up because of it. So I imagine there are many, many more documents like that buried in the archives.
Might I add, Suzanne, a positive possibility here? I remember talking with a genealogist who was trying to explain to me the revolution that AI has worked on their examination of documents, and came up with my great grandfather's wedding document from Tococin, Poland, from Tococin. It could translate this very cursive, ornate cursive hand that Polish officials would write in. It could read it and quite instantly translate into an almost perfect English. So it's once they get their hands on a document now, it's amazing how much more quickly they can decode it.
If the people or the government of that particular country are interested in that kind of information,
Yeah.
actually making it out there, which is the other side of the story, is that a lot of it was knowing what it is, and it may not make us look good if this goes out there again. That's certainly part of the story in certain places.
Simon, you talked about that this was your very first trip to going to Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Had you been to other camps? And as a Jewish
Yeah,
historian,
well, I'd been to I have this funny thing, Suzanne. I always, again, as a professor of mine, Richard Cobb at Oxford, colleague of mine really, but I always thought of him, he was much older. He always, and who was a great historian of the French Revolution, always talked about the indispensability of the archive of the feet. And so I'm actually almost make it an obligation, sort of tread the ground where something I'm talking about happens. In this case, I was a little averse to the notion that, I don't know, whatever was being presented to me, actually, of the Holocaust at Auschwitz would somehow just, I don't know, be over processed really for me. And I have to say that when I did go to Auschwitz for this film, I will to your answer, actually, first of all, Suzanne, sorry. Yes, I'd been to, I was at Theresienstadt, Terezin, in 1965, when not many people were going to Czechoslovakia, let alone to Terezin. There wasn't anything in the like of a formal. And also went to Treblinka, where there is nothing but Treblinka, but there is a sculptured monument. To me, it's actually extremely moving, but there's just a kind of bare emptiness. There is proposed now a Holocaust museum going to be made at Treblinka, about which immediately there have been instant disputes. But for me, the emptier the space, the more populated I felt it was. I mean, Hugo will tell you, I think, that I was physically profoundly shaken by the empty spaces at Birkenau. Vast plain of barracks, but also there's a grove of birch trees which we filmed, which was the place where in 1944, in the summer of 1944, with 400,000 Hungarian Jews, the whole system was kind of backing up on human remains. There were dead bodies just thrown around on the grass before being put into open fire pits. But the birch grove was the place where women, children, and men were ordered to strip naked before they knew they were going to their death. So all of that, partly perhaps because there's one photograph of those stripped women being really hurried to their end. But I think even if the photograph hadn't existed, that would have stayed in my mind. So oddly enough, in this particular case, quietness and emptiness actually brought me right into the middle of the scene. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. And as we wrap up real quickly, someone wrote that as an American living in these times, I finally truly understand the paralysis, that feeling, should I hope it will pass. And I suspect it's a feeling that many people are feeling these days. I don't know if you have any comment on that, or we just leave it at that.
Well, the only comment I'd say is I do think rather extraordinarily, and I do not. I think shallow analogies between, however, whatever the challenges are right now, and the Third Reich of the concentration camps. That's not right. I mean, each horror, I think, exists in its own realm of difficulty and cruelty and dismay and disruption and so on. But I would say I do think this is probably another period where people are having to decide in the manner that the Dutch were deciding in the years after 1941. We're seeing it play out in the decisions in high corporate law firms and in the universities. What is the right thing to do? Is the right thing to do hope it will indeed pass over? We're in Passover now, or is the right thing to do to make a noise, to stand up? Because if you don't do it, who will? And Jews have a long tradition, not just, I mean, one thing our film does, it's not a sheep to the slaughter film at all. You see this process of actually calculating between self-preservation and the necessity of doing something happening over and over and over again. And we are sort of in one of those places again.
Well, yeah. Simon, Hugo, Robert, thank you very much. Again, the film is The Holocaust 80 Years On. It premieres next week, April 22nd, which is during the week of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. I encourage everybody to see it. I know several people asked about today's program. It is recorded. We will be sending it out in a link to everybody who is registered. It'll be on our website tomorrow as well. Again, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you,
Hugo.
Nice to meet you, Hugo.
Right. Thank you very much for having me.